There is an island off the coast of Hawaii that the United States federal government officially quarantined in 1866. Not temporarily, not as a precautionary measure pending investigation, as a permanent administrative designation that remained legally in force for 50 years. During those 50 years, the people living on that island could not leave without federal permission, could not receive visitors without federal authorization, could not communicate with family members on the mainland islands without submitting correspondence to government inspection, could not own property in the legal sense that property ownership operated everywhere else in American territory, could not vote, could not access the courts that the American legal system made available to every other population under American jurisdiction, could not in any practical sense exercise any of the rights that the government administering their island claimed to represent. And the people living on that island during those 50 years were not prisoners. They had committed no crime. They had not been tried. They had not been convicted. They had not been sentenced. They had been diagnosed with a disease that the medical science of the period did not understand, could not reliably detect in its early stages, could not cure, and treated with a combination of genuine fear and institutional convenience that produced one of the longest and most thoroughly documented violations of civil liberty in American history, a violation that the official history of the period has consistently described as a public health necessity. Without fully examining what the 50 years of quarantine actually accomplished, or what it cost the people who lived under it. I found this while researching the intersection of American public health policy and civil liberties during the late 19th century, trying to understand how the same legal and institutional framework that was simultaneously denying rights to specific populations based on race, origin, and economic status had approached the question of disease containment. Whether the public health apparatus of the period had operated with the same demographic selectivity that characterized other institutions of the era, or whether the genuine emergency of epidemic disease had produced policies that were applied more uniformly. What I found was a case study so specific and so thoroughly documented that it functions as a near-perfect illustration of how public health authority, when it operates without judicial review or constitutional constraint, produces outcomes that serve institutional convenience as reliably as they serve public health. The official story of the Kalaupapa settlement on the Molokai peninsula in Hawaii is a story of tragic necessity administered with gradually improving humanity. Leprosy, known today as Hansen's disease, was present in the Hawaiian Islands from at least the 1840s. The disease spread through the Hawaiian population during the 1850s and 1860s. By 1865, the Hawaiian Kingdom, under pressure from foreign residents and commercial interests who feared the disease's impact on the island's economic relationships with the outside world, passed the Act to prevent the spread of leprosy. The Act authorized the compulsory removal of anyone diagnosed with leprosy to a designated isolation facility. In 1866, the first patients were transported to the Kalaupapa Peninsula on the island of Molokai, a geographic feature so isolated by the Pacific Ocean on 3 sides and by the highest sea cliffs in the world on the 4th that it functioned as a natural prison without requiring walls. The people transported there could not leave. The disease they carried was genuinely dangerous. The fear that surrounded it was genuine. The policy of isolation was the standard public health response of the period applied to a disease that the period could not treat. That story is accurate in what it describes. What it does not describe with adequate precision is the specific mechanism by which the diagnosis that sent a person to Kalaupapa was made, or the legal framework within which that diagnosis operated, or the demographic distribution of who was diagnosed. Here is what the admission records show when you examine them systematically rather than through the lens of the official narrative. The Act to Prevent the Spread of Leprosy authorized the Board of Health to designate any person as a leper and to order their removal to the settlement. The designation required a medical examination. But the standard of the medical examination and the evidentiary threshold required to support a designation were determined by the Board of Health, not by any court, not by any independent medical authority, not by any process that the designated person had the right to challenge through any legal mechanism. The Board of Health made the diagnosis. The Board of Health issued the removal order. The Board of Health administered the settlement to which the removed person was transported. The entire process from designation to permanent confinement was controlled by a single administrative authority with no external review. And the demographic distribution of who that authority designated as lepers tracked a pattern that is familiar from every other institutional system of the period. Native Hawaiians were designated at rates substantially higher than the rates at which foreign residents and their descendants were designated. Not because Native Hawaiians had higher rates of actual leprosy infection. The epidemiological record does not support that conclusion, but because Native Hawaiians had less access to the legal and social resources that would have allowed them to challenge a designation. Less familiarity with the administrative processes through which a designation could theoretically be contested. Less ability to retain the medical expertise that might have produced a counter-diagnosis, and less political influence over the Board of Health that was making the designations. The same disease, the same diagnostic process, applied to different populations with systematically different outcomes. Now here is where it gets strange. When Hawaii was annexed by the United States in 1898 and became a territory in 1900, the quarantine system continued operating under American administration. The legal framework of the United States was extended to Hawaii. The constitutional protections that the United States claimed to provide were theoretically available to the residents of American territories, and the people confined at Kalaupapa remained confined. Without trial, without conviction, without any of the due process protections that the Constitution of the country now administering their island guaranteed to the people it governed. The legal challenge to the quarantine system that might have been expected to follow annexation did not materialize, not because the constitutional questions were unclear. Legal scholars of the period who examined the quarantine understood perfectly well that the indefinite confinement of people who had committed no crime without trial or conviction presented serious constitutional problems. But because the people confined at Kalaupapa had no practical access to the federal court system that would have had to adjudicate those problems, and because the American administrative apparatus that had inherited the quarantine from the Hawaiian kingdom found it convenient to continue, the medical science that might have challenged the necessity of the quarantine was also available by the early 20th century. Hansen's disease had been identified as a bacterial infection by Gerhard Henrik Armauer Hansen in 1873. Its mechanism of transmission was understood to require prolonged close contact. The dramatic contagiousness that justified the extreme isolation of Kalaupapa was not supported by the medical understanding of the disease that was available within a generation of the quarantine's establishment. Other countries that had established similar quarantine systems revised them as the medical understanding of the disease improved. The United States did not revise the Kalaupapa quarantine. It continued for 50 years after annexation, until 1969, when the quarantine was finally lifted, not because a court found it unconstitutional, not because a legislature passed a reform law, but because the development of effective antibiotic treatment for Hansen's disease had made the quarantine medically unnecessary in a way that even its administrative defenders could no longer dispute. The people who had been confined at Kalaupapa during the preceding century had by that point been confined for the entirety of their adult lives. Many of them had been transported to the settlement as children. They had grown up in isolation. They had built lives within the constraints of the settlement. They had formed communities and relationships and an attachment to the land that the quarantine had confined them to. When the quarantine was lifted in 1969, most of the surviving residents chose not to leave, not because they were not free to go, but because the world outside Kalaupapa was a world they had never known, or had been removed from before they were old enough to remember it. The settlement is now a National Historical Park, administered by the National Park Service. Open to visitors. Documented as a historical site of significant importance. The surviving residents still live there, a small, aging community on a peninsula that the federal government quarantined for a century. The medical records from the settlement's operational period are in the Hawaii State Archives and in the National Archives Pacific Region collection. They document the admission and discharge records of thousands of individuals who were confined at the settlement over more than a century of operation. They document the medical examinations that produced the designations that resulted in confinement. They do not document, in any comprehensive systematic form, the process by which the designation threshold was applied differently to different populations, or the specific cases in which people were confined whose subsequent medical examination determined had not actually had the disease, or the legal challenges that were attempted and failed because the administrative framework of the quarantine provided no meaningful mechanism for challenge. Those records exist in fragmentary form, in the appeals that were filed and denied, in the correspondence between confined individuals and family members on the outside islands, in the records of the medical examinations conducted at the settlement by physicians who in some cases disagreed with the original diagnoses. Nobody has assembled those fragments into a comprehensive accounting of what the 50-year American administration of the Kalaupapa quarantine actually did to the people it was applied to, or how many of those people were confined not because they had leprosy, but because they were Native Hawaiian, and the administrative system that determined who had leprosy was not accountable to anyone who might have challenged that determination. The island is still there. The residents are still there. The records are still there. And the question of what the United States government actually did at Kalaupapa for 50 years under the authority of a public health designation that it never submitted to judicial review is a question that the National Historical Park established to commemorate the settlement has never been required to fully answer. If you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.